you referenced Tiger Woods. He had coaches who were not as good golf players as him coaching him. And people might say, well, why would the best golf player in the world hire someone who's not as good at golf to be his coach? Can you let us know why?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is well established in most athletic fields that the best coaches are not the best players. And I think being a good coach is often being able to step outside of someone's performance, see what they're doing, and see how they can make improvements. And that turns out to be quite different from being able to see and do it yourself.
James Schramko here. Welcome back to my podcast. This is episode 1082. We're chatting with Scott Young again. Welcome back, Scott.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
So last time we talked about ultralearning, and that was about 5 years ago, as it turns out. It was episode 689. And fun fact, we got rid of a lot of old podcasts where they were either no one was visiting or they weren't linked to. But it turns out your podcast is still interesting to people 5 years later. And I think that's a testimony to the practical nature of the need to learn things. And the reason for our podcast today is I just got a copy of your new book, and it's called Get Better at Anything, and it's 12 Maxims for Mastery. I got the book about 48 hours ago, and I read the book last night. And I mean, wow, what a great book. This is something I've really missed as a podcaster. I've done plenty of solo episodes lately. I've done a few podcasts with partners and with case study clients of mine. But what I really want to inject back into this podcast is taking in a brand new book, reading it, and then talking with the person who wrote it. It can't have just been you though, Scott. This book has got something unusual about it. It has pages and pages and pages of research references. There's like, I don't think I've ever seen this much outside of a textbook from school or whatever. There's almost half a chapter here of just references. It's so well researched. Congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, the goal for writing the book was to try to dissect this kind of crazy world of cognitive science and all of the research that's been done. But it often isn't that well organized, or like what you said, you have to pick up one of these sort of dusty textbooks to read it through. So I hope I made it fun and enjoyable for you and not just slogging through the book to read. But I did want to also try to make it grounded in some of the research that we know about how learning works.
I've been binge watching a few YouTube channels lately as part of my research, of course, to make good content. And I noticed your book follows a similar philosophy, and that is like you start reading and then you just keep going because it's like really fascinating topics. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We'll throw a few out there. Why did it take 2 decades before Tetris players began to master the game? Fascinating. And I remember I recently watched that Tetris movie, so I had a lot of context to the foundation of that game. Why professional poker players make better predictions than psychiatrists. The secret to artistic training of master painters during the Renaissance. And I think that one would really stir up people in my online marketing world because there's been a lot of discussions about that recently, about people copying. To throw a little breadcrumb there, and what the London Blitz teaches about neuroscience of anxiety. So like, as you're pulling the thread through this book, it was really well laid out. I like you put it into 3 main stages and then you expanded each stage, and they made sense once you understand the stage. And the reason I think this is such a practical book, Get Better at Anything, is because it fits perfectly with my fundamental understanding of selling. And what I do as a mentor is I believe people buy to be better off. There is a huge market of people who want to be better off. And in your book, actually, it was really contextually relevant. You talk about how some experts are terrible teachers, and also why people should form a brains trust or get an external observer. Like I think you referenced Tiger Woods. He had coaches who were not as good golf players as him coaching him. And people might say, well, why would the best golf player in the world hire someone who's not as good at golf to be his coach? Can you let us know why?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is well established in most athletic fields that the best coaches are not the best players. I mean, just watch a football game and then look at the guy on the sidelines and like, you don't really imagine this guy running down the field to score a touchdown, right? Being a good coach is just a different set of abilities from being a good player. And I think being a good coach is often being able to step outside of someone's performance, see what they're doing, and see how they can make improvements. And that turns out to be quite different from being able to see and do it yourself. So coaching is an incredibly important skill. And I think, it's almost universally the case that the people who make the best coaches, they have to understand the skill. They probably have to be at least somewhat proficient at it. Most of these golf coaches are not like terrible golfers, but it's different from being able to execute it yourself and being able to see someone's performance, say, you know what, if you did it this way, you'd get better results.
I can relate to that as a surfer. If you catch an amazing wave, you can sometimes hardly even remember it. But if someone caught it on video and you play it back, you can see all sorts of things you can't see from your point of view. You can see like your foot positioning or where you're turning or how the wave actually panned out versus what you remember it in your mind to be, where you're positioned on the wave and stuff. It's such a critical thing to have that feedback loop, which is one of the three things, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main things that we have when we're performing a skill is all of our attention is in performing the skill. So there isn't that much room left over to analyze our performance. And sometimes that can even make it worse. That in golf, they talk about like getting the yips, which in some ways is this kind of like conscious, deliberate part of your brain overriding this sort of fluent motor action that you developed through a lot of practice. And so you really do need that separate person because you can't do the skill and also monitor your performance and see how you're doing it at the same time.
Love it. Well, to reveal the first of the three stages, why don't we talk about this Tetris situation? It does seem unusual, doesn't it, that for 20 years people are playing the game and then all of a sudden new benchmarks are being met. I remember we've always heard about that 4-minute mile, right? Like no one could do it, and then when someone did it, everyone could do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is similar in that way, except if it, like, the analogy would be like, it's as if people were running like a mile, but it took them like an hour. And now you've got like 12 and 13-year-olds doing it in 4 minutes. That's probably like the correct analogy here to like show the magnitude. It's difficult to like really put into perspective, like how much better these 12 and 13-year-old kids are at Tetris today than people who were equally obsessed with it in the early 90s. And so, I got hooked onto this story because the YouTuber John Green just posted this video where he was like, why are people just so much better at Tetris 20 years after the game came out? And his conclusion, and I agree with, was that really the environment that people have practiced in has changed. It used to be the case that you're playing a video game, maybe your like brother's older friend can like give you a few tips and be like, hey, you can do it this way, or try to do this, or use this bar in this way. And you could learn from that. And of course, you learn from your own trial and error, your own experiments and observations about the game. But you weren't able to learn from a large body of people, a large group of people who are all innovating. And if there were techniques, so one of the early techniques that was found by one player is that, like, if you kind of jiggle your thumb in a very specific way, you can tap the button faster than just holding it down. And this turns out to be really important for making progress beyond a certain point, because at a certain point, the game gets so fast that if you do it the way you'd think you'd have to play the game, you're too slow. You can't actually complete the level. And so, and nowadays there's even techniques that like the more recent history of it is that now kids are like, wearing a glove and they're doing this like kind of weird tapping thing on the bottom of the controller. It's just really bizarre stuff that you would never figure out on your own. But now you can have video, you can have live stream, you can see people doing it. And so, I mean, Tetris is a little bit of a silly example, but at the same time, at the core, it reveals something very deep about how people learn, which is that we are a cultural species. Most of what we know comes from other people. And so if an environment enables that and it makes it easier to learn from other people, then we shouldn't be surprised that innovation and learning accelerate as a result.
Well, with a 5-year-old kid, I can definitely see it. She just wants to do everything that I do. And it was actually one of the biggest takeaways I ever got on any of my podcasts when I was speaking to a parenting educator. She said, your daughter just wants to do what you do. And so she's there cutting up her own fruit for her lunch. She makes her own lunch. She just wants to do it, but she's observing how I do it. And if I make a slight change in my technique, she's going to adapt that change as well. So when you made that example, it just made sense. Well, if everyone was practicing in a vacuum or posting results in a difficult way, the benchmark was moving very slowly and there was just lack of awareness. And it made me think back to sailing competitions. I used to be a competitive sailor. Probably almost nobody on this podcast audience would know this. I came second in the world titles at one point. Wow. in a class called 18-foot skiff. And we used to race on Sydney Harbour. But it was when you go to those inter-club competitions or the, like world titles, for example, you got people coming from other countries. It's where you see, oh, that's how they do this or that's how they do that. And that's where the innovation would come from when you get exposure to it. So it does make sense with technology and exposure. It seems like someone born in this generation with, University of YouTube could probably fast track their learning through that first component of being able to see what other people are doing. And one final example, I recently did a chrome delete on my car. And that's where you take something that's chrome, like a badge or a grill, and you make it black, like matte black. And so I just watched a video of a guy doing it, unscrewing his radiator and masking it up and preparing it, and the exact same product that he used, and then spraying it and then putting it back on. And my daughter and I did the job perfectly just by copying the YouTube video. Now, if I had to try and figure that out myself without seeing someone do it first, it would have been so much harder.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I think has really changed in our society over the years, is that information has become more accessible. Now, we can also talk about how this is sort of a double-edged sword, because there's lots of videos that are, useful and practical, but then there's also lots that are like entertaining and distracting. So I think the rise of technology, I mean, it's become the case that, yes, if you want to be a master Tetris player, it's much easier to do that, but it's also easier to just sit back and watch people play and not play yourself too. So I think there's lots of areas where, the people who are the best, the people who are taking advantage of these resources can really make gains, but it's not automatic. You don't have that just by default, just because you're in that environment. You have to work at it too.
There must also be inflation. Like, obviously, everyone can be a good Tetris player if they can be exposed to the techniques. So now the bar is leveled to some extent. So yes, you're getting better results than 2 decades ago, but now you could, what is it? In one of the references, you said that in a typical competition for Tetris now, they might max out the score like 20 something times in a competition when it's never been done for 20 years. If everyone's doing it now, the level is so high that you're back to the standard is pretty far from where it used to be as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, this is kind of innovation in general works this way. It's sort of cumulative, because it's so much easier to learn a solution once someone's found a method that works, because everyone can copy it. Yeah, it's always a shifting goalpost. But I tend to think that, while that is true that, like, competitively speaking, like, maybe the amount of effort required to be number one in the world in a field is, fairly constant, just because the available innovations that are out there are changing. But I mean, as a society, what we care about is like getting results. So I think, in a lot of fields, if you're able to do more useful stuff, it's not just purely competitive. If you're able to serve people better, you're able to do things better. I mean, just the fact that you're able to do this in a way where you can learn from other people, you're delivering more value,
There's kind of a clue in that. You know what I was saying about learning from the YouTube video and then implementing it. I really enjoyed the section where you are talking about the research into people who try to solve problems and the difference between if you know the technique or don't know the technique to solve the problem. So in the case of where I wanted to achieve an outcome, I wanted to get better at chrome deleting my vehicle, knowing the answer before I started made it very easy for me compared to if I had to figure it out. I'm sure I could have, and I've probably done it in the past, but there were a few little subtle things that would have had a big learning curve. For example, the video that showed me how to do it, he did 4 coats. He did a very light coat and then another coat and then another coat and then a final coat. I'm pretty sure if I did it myself, I would have just sprayed it once, and it might have had sort of more inconsistent surface coverage. Can you talk about the difference between knowing the outcome or not based on the research you found, especially when it comes to academia? We noticed that some people like to put more emphasis on the student having to try and figure it out, but the research showed some really interesting things there.
Yeah, I mean, this is an idea that if you are trying to learn from a problem, one of the things that, we've obviously talked about in this Tetris example is that if you are forced to figure it out on your own, maybe you just don't realize that, like, okay, actually you want to do 4 coats because it's going to be kind of goopy. Otherwise, it's not going to make a nice even finish. And so there is the chance that if you don't have the method taught to you, you may not actually learn the correct method. I think that's probably the biggest reason why we learn better from other people, because trial and error, these sort of weak methods that we talk about for problem solving, they just don't always get you to the best solution. And so this is certainly an example of Tetris, like the weird ways people are pressing buttons. Like, you're never getting to that just through a lot of practice, because they're just so, they're so outside of what you would just trial and error on your own. But the other issue, which is, I think, also related to this research, I talk about this in the context of cognitive load theory, is it can even be the case that even if you did figure out the problem on your own, you may not be able to generalize it as well. You may not be able to use it as well, because you're so focused on trying to figure out how to solve the problem that you're not paying attention to the patterns that are involved in solving the problem. So I can think of an example from my own experience of, I'm not a very good person for solving Rubik's Cubes. I haven't learned the correct approach to solving Rubik's Cubes. I know it exists out there. It's just not been something I've done before. But I remember playing with it once. And sometimes you can get I got a color to the right side, but I don't quite remember exactly what I did, because I was just sort of moving things and trying to do stuff. And this is, I think, kind of a good example of that effect, that sometimes you can just be trying things out and you get something to work, but you're not really even paying attention to how it works. And so the idea here is that if you see some demonstration, all of your attention can be paid to what is the person doing? How are they doing it? And this can often be more useful for building problem-solving schema than actually schema is this sort of fancy cognitive science word for, learning pattern, but it's more useful for building these schemata than trying to just do problem-solving on your own. And I thought that was a very interesting idea from the research that's often underappreciated.
Yeah, on that Rubik's Cube, I remember one of my sons was particularly good at solving them, and he could apply the same ideas to each different type. I used to buy him different types of cubes, ones with more faces or different shapes, and he was able to figure them all out. And that's the first time that I remember being conscious of the idea of an algorithm. Mm-hmm. And it sounds probably similar to a schema, but he was using an algorithm that predictively got him the result, even if he tried a new device. So that was the difference between him being able to identify what it was that he was actually doing that was working, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to think about it is solving a Rubik's Cube, and really solving any problem in life has a similar thing, that there's moves you can make. And if you have the right kind of pattern for okay, well, I need to do this move to get past this particular problem. If you have that library of moves, then you can solve a Rubik's Cube fairly trivially. If you don't have that library of moves, it can take an enormous amount of trial and error and not make a lot of progress. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, learning from observation is so powerful, is because it can load that library with those sort of methods that allow you to make progress initially.
I really, truly think that's what I do for a living. I've put my moves into playbooks. And so when someone comes to me, let's say they have a membership and they don't have any retention strategy whatsoever, I give them a retention strategy and they implement it and they get a result, because I've been able to observe, I can see a gap, I know the move, I teach them the move. They don't have to put a scrap of energy into inventing or coming up with or researching or developing that playbook. It's just there to install. And so I've seen the profound power of that. I wonder, when it comes to the professional poker players, that was also interesting, because we saw a shift between traditional Mississippi River type poker playing to when the online poker players came into the scene, and there was a disruption there. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean, poker is just such a game with a fascinating history. As you allude to, it was originally this Mississippi riverboat gambling, where it was basically just a bunch of people swindling each other. This was not a lot of genuine games, and the key was who could be the bigger crook. And it kind of gained a reputation for skill, and sort of that kind of wild days sort of boiled down. And not to say that it totally went away, but it transformed into a game where, okay, this was something about reading people and understanding their motivation, their psychology. Still a really big part of the game. But there was a shift when online poker came about, because the sort of previous way of doing poker is you go to these casinos, especially if you're any good, you're going to high stake casinos, and you're playing your hands, but the hands are slow and they're for a lot of money. And a lot of what you're trying to do is sort of, you have some strategy, but you're also trying to read your opponent and figure out when they're bluffing and this kind of thing. Whereas when you're playing online, two things happen. First of all, you're not seeing another person's face. So a lot of this interpersonal stuff, I mean, you can still see how someone tends to play if they're, playing very tight or if they're playing very loose. You can still get those kind of patterns. So I don't want to say there's zero psychologizing, but you're not looking for tells. You're not looking for like, this person scratches their nose when they're bluffing. Like, you can't see any of that. So the psychology takes a bit of a backseat in favor of maybe a more technical analysis. So it becomes a little bit more of a mathematical game. But another major factor is you can play a lot more games. So you can play, some people can play multiple rooms at a time. So you're playing way more games. So your volume of practice increases. And then also, because you're doing it on a computer, you can keep your hand history. You can keep track of everything you're doing. So this sort of, I think, further accelerates this kind of mathematization of how the game is played, because now you can have these sort of like detailed grids of like, this is exactly how you've played every single starting hand in every single position. And like, this is how you should have played it ideally, according to some kind of, computerized strategy. And like, okay, well, when you're doing this a little bit too much. You're doing that a little too little. And so there's all these sort of, now sophisticated ways you can calibrate your play that essentially, that would have been impossible in the casino days. And so you see players like I talk about Annette Oberstadt, who became a World Series of Poker champion in Europe when she was still too young to play legally in the United States. And so that's just sort of an example of someone who really took advantage of this unique training opportunity to get really good in a short period of time.
Reminds me of that Gran Turismo movie, the story of a player they took from who was playing arcade games and they put him in real race cars. And despite the critics, he ended up being particularly good. And he was taking different lines than the racing drivers, which he'd learned from this repetition of the online driving games. And now in Formula One, arguably, the current best generation of drivers are the ones who have spent the most time on simulators, especially during COVID, the e-games.
Yeah.
They're so good on the e-games. It's like they've just had a lot more time in. And I feel like I'm talking of the new technology. If you slide back hundreds of years, there's some lessons from the Renaissance master painters that could be applicable in terms of time on the tools and the processes that might be surprising for people. I'd love to know if you're happy to share the artistic training methods of Renaissance painters, because I think it's going to shock people who like to take shortcuts, that's for sure.
Well, the artistic training, like around the Renaissance, was a time period where artistic training was dominated by this guild model. So they were these guilds, and apprentices were working under a master painter. And so the process is like you show up in one of these workshops, and often you're doing like sort of small tasks, and you're seeing what the person's doing and you're copying from masterworks, and you're sort of slowly progressing over a number of years in your craft. And you're learning through a lot of imitation. And this was sort of, I think, kind of just how a lot of skilled crafts worked in majority of the world, still do to this day to a certain extent, of this sort of approach to learning. And it was just sort of around the time of the Renaissance when you see this sort of explosion of virtuosic talent, people like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, this kind of thing, that you see a transition to a more scholastic way of doing things. So you have the academy system, which flourished for a number of centuries, and the academy tradition as well kind of continued this same sort of process of like starting off small, imitation, building up, sort of mastery of technique. Of course, it was a little bit different from the apprenticeship model too. But then you see a little bit of a right turn later on where the emphasis was more on creativity and less on technique. And so you can see this even in a lot of art classes today that, I remember taking art classes in high school, and there wasn't a lot of, drawing instruction. There wasn't a lot of instruction where like, this is the right way to sort of learn these fundamental techniques about light and color and this kind of stuff. And as a result, kids just sort of like did their own thing and tried to figure stuff out and, weren't that successful at learning these skills. Indeed, often getting the wrong impression, getting the idea that like, there aren't even any skills to learn, like that being artistic is just a matter of pure talent, of, originality and genius. And so I really thought it was very interesting that there's this whole parallel case of how, some of these techniques we were talking about, the worked example effect, John Speller's research, this kind of stuff, that really parallels a lot of these teaching techniques that were used way back in the Renaissance.
So basically the first phase is we can see things happening. The next phase is just like a lot of the practicing, putting that time in and learning different models and methods for learning. And then the third phase is that feedback. Is that right? Having a review and making adjustments. It sort of speaks to the possibility that someone could be doing something for a long time, but not actually getting better at it.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of places that this sort of process can break down. Like we talked about one like where if you're not able to learn from other people. Yeah. Well, but we talked about like if you're not able to learn from other people, so if the C part is missing, then you're kind of stuck doing this problem solving, reinventing the wheel, so to speak. And it's much harder to get up to the frontier, get up to the cutting edge of a field. And obviously, if you're not doing any practice, it's very difficult to build proficiency because what practice is doing is making it more fluent, more automatic, easier for you to apply. That has its own disadvantages as well, because if you practice the wrong things, you can go in a detour, but it's certainly necessary for anything complicated to do a lot of practice. But then also the other end, the feedback end, and we were talking about the poker players, like the well-calibrated feedback was essential for honing that intuition, because we're talking about a game where like the difference between being a really winning poker player and being a like bad losing poker player might be like 55% of your bets versus 45% of your bets. That is quite a lot in the long run, but it might mean that like on any particular hand, any particular play you make, you have to see it a lot of times before you know whether you're a winning player or a losing player. And so I think, in some ways, the rise of like online poker was fueled with all these players who are 45% players who think they're 55% players. And, they go a while before they run out of money and they realize, actually, I'm a losing player. I'm not actually as good as these other people. And this contrasts with a lot of other professions where we have a lot of experience, but we're still making those 55-45 bets, but we don't get that calibrating feedback. And so, we're doing it a lot. We're, seeing, we're doing, we're building up that fluency, that proficiency, that confidence, that overconfidence. But if you actually look at our performance, especially if you can benchmark it against some like pretty simple models, we don't actually perform that well. And so that was the other kind of half of that chapter of talking about the research, Paul Meal's work, Philip Tetlock's work with super forecasters, just showing how, a lot of experts are maybe not as good as they think they are.
It's fascinating. It actually reminds me of how I think Mercedes-Benz did a pretty good job with our dealer network back when I was the general manager. They would cross-pollinate the best practice between dealerships. I was actually invited to provide training to the other sales managers on how to find, recruit, and train salespeople to get them to a high-performing level. So they would cross-pollinate the best ideas between their other dealerships. And then they would benchmark them with accountants and spreadsheets, and then we'd come together to have reviews and to see where the gaps were and what other people are doing better. And they'd have, it was like trump cards. I don't know if you ever played that as a kid, but probably a generation before you. But you'd sit and compare stats. Like, this is our effective hourly rate for the workshop. This is our throughput rate. Here's our revenue per employee. And you need to see where people are shining and what they're doing to achieve that. I mean, most people in the online entrepreneurial space know the importance of tracking data or having some kind of metrics or dashboard, but it's still surprising to me when I take on a new client and we have a look at their awareness of their own activities. There's still often massive gaps. Like they don't know what a customer's worth, or they don't know how long a member stays in their membership. Without that, you don't know if all those activities you've been doing are winning or losing,
Well, I mean, and it also brings up another point of how like our intuition and our memory of these things can be fallible, right? So you have some, overall impression of how good you are at making these kinds of judgments. But sometimes the right move is, like you said, is to collect that data, collect those trump cards, to like see what the stats are saying about what you're doing, because your memory is fallible, and you focus on individual cases. So I think like a takeaway from the research is that our intuition and our memory is very good at capturing instances. It's It's very good at capturing, like, this is what happened in this particular case. And so that works really well when remembering a particular case is good for solving the problem. So if you're playing chess, for instance, okay, when the board is like this and I did this and that resulted in me being checkmate, don't do that again. Like, it works pretty well for that. But if what your memory is doing is sort of like, again, these 55-45 bets, these bets were like, most of the time, even if you're right, you're still going to lose, or you're going to lose, just a little bit, and you just need to get that edge somewhere, then you're really aggregating a lot of different little weak pieces of information. And so that's where, models are having, like, this is how, like, the typical customer goes, or this is how this goes. That's very important to collect that kind of data.
Well, I think what you're sort of pointing at there is like sample size.
Mm-hmm.
I often remember that sort of ABC formula, like the activator, behavior, consequence. Like if you had a small sample size of one Coke vending machine, like let's say you're visiting a sports event and there's a Coke machine, you put your coin in and you push the button, but the Coke doesn't come out, it gets jammed. But that's the first time you've ever used the machine. You could form the opinion that these things don't work. But if you're with a friend and they said, oh, listen, I've used these things 1,000 times. Like we had one in our lunchroom at work. I've used them in everywhere I've visited, and I've never had that happen to me. It's like it happened maybe 1 in 1,000 times. Then that experience or that exposure to more data could actually give you a better insight into the probabilities of that machine working in a different venue. So
definitely. I mean, yeah, being able to get more practice is very important in an uncertain domain.
For sure. Let's talk about the London Blitz and what that teaches us about anxiety, because that also I feel like is hugely practical that we can apply to other aspects of our life.
Yeah, so this was a fascinating one for me. So I first encountered this story from Stanley Rockman. He was a clinical psychologist specializing in, fear, anxiety, kind of the theories of that. And one of the things that he talks about, and there's like lots of commentators from the time around World War II, is that if you look at like sort of the pre-World War II plan, so that already, conflict with Germany, they're expecting it. You've got planners who are thinking about like what's going to happen. And in this time period, a new threat had emerged. There is now planes that can drop bombs on cities. And so they were anticipating that this is going to happen. It doesn't take that much extrapolation to be like, yep, that's what's going to happen. They're going to do this. And the response from pretty much everyone involved, so the psychologists, the war planners, the politicians, everyone is thinking there is going to be mass panic. Because you can just imagine how terrifying that would be. And I mean, there's no doubt about it. It is terrifying to be bombed when you're like in your sleep and then there's some air raid siren. And so there was all these predictions about what would happen. There was predictions that, the entire city population is going to flee to the suburbs, that there's going to be people trampled to death at the, tube stations because they're trying to get undercover and this kind of thing. And this was the prediction. There's many, many instances of people thinking this was going to happen, including psychologists, including people who like understanding these issues should be, that should be their central point of expertise. And what they actually found was that didn't happen at all. Now, obviously, the Blitz was awful and many people died, and it was certainly not a pleasant thing to live through, even if you did survive. But this prediction that what would happen is that people would break down, social order would break down, people would be panicking in the streets, trampling over people, having these sort of like long-term cases of neuroses as a result of this happening. That didn't happen. And we have lots of evidence that shows that this isn't just true of the Blitz, but it's also true of many other, wartime conflicts where people are experiencing this kind of acute, stressful environment. They don't actually respond this way. And so Rockman's sort of understanding of this, and I think is very kind of useful to think about, is that we know from therapeutic context that exposure, meaning that, if you have a spider phobia and I give you exposure to spiders, what usually happens is that your fear level will decline with repeated exposures. And this is often because, we have a heightened fear of spiders, but if you actually interact with a spider, most of the time, the thing that you're most afraid of doesn't actually happen. And even if the spider did, let's say, bite you, it's probably not as bad as you think it's going to be. And so if you were to have more exposure, your fear would go down. In contrast, if you are anxious about something or you have fear about something and you avoid that situation, which is a very natural response, you never get that feedback from the environment. You never get that signal that tells you, oh, actually, the danger you're experiencing is not as likely as it would be. And so you can maintain this very high level of fear for a long period of time, even if it is irrational, just because you avoid it, just because you are kind of neglecting this exposure that might change your mind about it.
It's so useful. For me, that was taking on slightly bigger waves when I'm surfing. It is scary and intimidating, but with repeated exposure, you get more and more comfortable with it.
Well, certainly selling is another one too. Like, how uncomfortable are people trying to like make sales calls or doing this kind of stuff, you know?
It's fascinating. The easiest fix for me when I encounter that, which is pretty common, is to redefine what selling actually is. Most people have the wrong definition of selling, which makes them scared of it. But when I actually reclassify it, it takes all the fear away. Most people have had a bad experience as a buyer and they think that selling something dirty that you do to someone, you know, because they've been pushed or manipulated. And once I reframe it as simply just a process of someone being better off, then you create an environment where people can be better off and you have a great product where that is true. Then it's actually a really joyful process to help people experience the new better off scenario where they can actually invest in something themselves and get a better outcome, which, you know, someone buying your book, get better at anything, they'd pay the money because they want to be better off. They buy the book, they read the book, implement the ideas in the book, and their life is improved. Then that was a worthwhile investment in themselves. And the money that comes back through the publisher or royalties or whatever is just the byproduct of that process.
Well, I think what you point out is very valid because there's sort of two issues here. So one is this kind of like unconscious anxiety reaction. So I'm talking about selling something and I just have this visceral reaction to it. And this is what I think a lot of the research on anxiety, the sort of neuroscience that was alluded to before, shows that there's these circuits in the brain that kind of detect threats. And this learning through exposure is a way of kind of suppressing some of that circuitry. But then there's also what you're talking about, which is the sort of the conceptualization, the beliefs that surround something, how you think of it. They're mutually interacting. So if you have this sort of visceral reaction to it, you're also likely to construe it in a very negative light too, right? So if you have this like, you know, you can't explain where it comes from, but this sort of, I don't feel like selling to someone. But then that negative feeling is also going to make me think about bad buying experiences I had. Like that one time that there was that really aggressive street hawker and I just felt awful. And, you know, I'd hate to be that person. And I don't think about all the experiences where like, you know, I had a really good relationship with someone and they actually directed me towards finding a product that better suited my needs than I originally thought existed, and I was ended up better off. Like that is the positive experience, but it's even harder to access that when you're in that fear state. So the exposure, I think, it not only helps by overcoming it in this sort of mechanical way, this sort of visceral response, but it also allows us to see new ways of thinking about it. And you can reframe it so that even something that was terrifying actually becomes exciting, or it becomes fun, or it becomes helpful or useful, or however you might want to think about it.
Yeah, it is valid. It's like that movie Moana where she's not allowed to leave the island, but, you know, they used to leave the island all the time. Or, you know, a tribe saying, don't go into that forest because, you know, there's animals that will kill you. And so, like, just by not going into the forest, you think, well, I've been saved from a certain death. But the reality is you may not have been mauled to death or whatever. And I like this simple philosophy. If you're going to dedicate a lot of energy and resource to all the negative things that happens, it's only fair that you balance the ledger with things that could go well as well. What could be the positive for trying that? What could be the upside? I think selling is truly one of the greatest potential upsides for most people who are scared of it. The alternate reality they could enjoy if they were into the sales process would be stratospheric. I made a playbook for people, a way that they can sell higher priced products. And I shared it with a very meek and mild vegan friend of mine who sells a program to help people cut overeating and highly processed foods out of their life. And he used that on a phone call with a prospect and made a sale worth thousands of euros. And it almost shocked him that it was just so easy and so natural, and he was doing it in a way that can actually help the person he was talking to. So I think when you unlock that game, it's tremendous. One question I did have is, how would you say get better at anything is different to ultra learning?
Yeah. I mean, I've been joking about this because this question has come up on some of the podcasts, and really like my entire career has been devoted to like figuring out how learning works. So even before ultra learning, I had an ebook called Learn More, Study Less. I've had many programs, coaching things. So in some ways, this is just the continued obsession of my life of continuing to write and think about these topics. But the other answer to that question is just that ultra learning had a very specific frame. I was very interested in people who had taken on intense, aggressive, self-directed learning projects. So, some of the projects that I did, like MIT's 4-year computer science curriculum in 12 months, or learning multiple languages in a year, but also people that I'd heard about or I'd met or I'd encountered. So people who designed and sold their whole video game and built it all, the parts, the art, the music, the programming all themselves. And, the guy who is the best Scrabble player in the world. And so focusing on these sort of intense individuals who accomplish something very specific, and like, what can we infer about that? Whereas for me, the starting point for writing this book was the Tetris story, because it wasn't a story about an individual Tetris player. It was, here's something that's changed in the environment, and that has accelerated learning. And what does that mean about what the ingredients for learning are? So I think if anyone's interested in this topic, you can certainly read both books. They're complementary, but they look at it from different angles. And so hopefully, I mean, you've looked at both of them. You can kind of attest that while there are some common themes and some common overlap, like as is necessary with the subject of this book, I've really done my best to try to, provide new material, provide new ways of thinking about these problems. And I mean, if people like these books, I could imagine myself writing a dozen of them, because there's just so much there about the process of improvement that could be helpful to people.
Please do keep writing them, Scott, and come back and share your wisdom. I mean, look, it's been 5 years since the last book. I'm literally doing the process in the book. I'm exposing myself to new material, to organized research, information. People like you are doing me a huge favor. You're giving me confirmation of some of the things I've held true. You're giving me new insights into understanding why things work the way they do. I still got plenty of takeaways from the book. One was the acknowledgement that the environment now has changed from when I started online. That's why I continue to innovate and stay on top of it. There's plenty of people in my industry who are still resting on 10-year-old laurels, and they will die out. They'll fade. The second thing is that process of actually reading your book and now talking to you is that's kind of my job now, is to extract wisdom from a book, bring it to my audience via the podcast. And then the third phase will be, we gauge the response to the podcast, and I get the inevitable emails saying, thank you, I really enjoyed that episode, or thanks for that podcast with Scott. It really changed my mind on such and such. But for me as an educator, what I really gleaned from the book is that it's worth seeking out the best possible solutions to problems in advance, and then to pay for someone or to get help to apply them, and then to analyze and get feedback on that data. And it reminded me of my friend at the local gym here, who I pay to train me for strength and conditioning training. He's got decades of experience. He's in the top 12 for his age group, I think, in the world for CrossFit. He's the strongest man in our area. And for me to walk in and just access that information instantly for a small fee is, I mean, we've had such big results in such a short time. It could take me decades, or I could potentially never even get to anywhere close to that level, trying to figure it out myself. That's really it's reinforced the value for, a lot of the experts and agencies who I represent or work for or partner with, where the value is. And it reminds me of that Picasso story, when he's in a restaurant and someone comes up to him and, hey, you're Picasso, can you do me a sketch? And he whips out a napkin and sketches, I think it was a goat. And then the guy goes to grab it and he goes, hey, look, that'll be, was it 100,000 pounds or something? I can't remember the amount. They go, but it just took you a few minutes, He goes, no, it took me 40 years. And so that's why I really like that Renaissance thing, that you can't underestimate the time in the value that we're getting. That's why you should do well with your book, Scott, and any associated things you do around that book, because you've put so much time and effort into that. I mean, seriously, the amount of research in that, it's intimidating, actually. It reminds me of how hard a book is. Well done. This is episode 1082. I've been chatting with Scott Young. He's got this book, Get Better at Anything. I really, really enjoyed reading that book, and I want to do more of this. So keep writing them.
Oh, thank you very much.
This is James Schramko.